You remember Dien Bien Phu? No. The same thing happened in Algeria, in Africa. They didn't have anything but a rifle. The French had all these highly mechanized instruments of warfare, but they put some guerrilla action on.
Hello and welcome to Guerrilla History, the podcast that acts as a reconnaissance report of global proletarian history and aims to use the lessons of history to analyze the present. I'm one of your co-hosts, Henry Huckmackie, unfortunately not joined at this moment by my usual co-host, who of course is Professor Adnan Hussain, a historian director at the School of Religion at Queen's University in Ontario, Canada, although we are hoping that he will be able to join us during the conversation before the end of it. So if you hear his voice magically come in during the middle of the conversation, that's why. We have a really fascinating conversation ahead of us today with a really great guest, somebody who I've been chatting with, off the record before we got into this conversation. We have a lot to cover in this conversation. But before I introduce the guest and have her introduce her research interests and the study in particular that we'll be talking about today, I would like to remind you listeners that you can help support the show and allow us to continue producing episodes like this by going to patreon.com/Guerrilla History. That's GUERRILLA History. And you can keep up to date with everything that we are doing individually as well as collectively by following us on various social media platforms. We're on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod. Again, Guerrilla 2 R's. We're on Instagram, Guerrilla_history. And probably the best way to keep up to date with everything is by joining our free Substack, guerrillahistory.substack.com. And that way you'll get updates periodically, not super frequently, to your email inbox directly without having to rely on a social media algorithm to tell you what we're doing. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I am very pleased to be joined by Sardana Nikolaeva, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. Hello, Sardana. It's nice to have you on the program. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your research interests?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited as a fan of the show for some time. I think I listened to most of your episodes. So
that's a lot of episodes. It's a lot of hours.
So I'm very excited. I walk a lot. So thank you very much for having me and having this conversation about the study, the collaborative study that we did at the ZBing Lab, the Global Indigenous Politics Collaboratory, with the Department of Political Science of the University of Toronto. And I was the inaugural postdoctoral fellow of ZBing Lab in 2022-2024, where during that time, this is the major special study that we completed by the end of 2024. And I'm myself from the Sakha Republic, which is the northeastern part of Russia. And it's like some of the part of it, half of it is located in the Arctic. And I'm the member of the Indigenous Sakha group within the Sakha Republic. I did my studies in Russia, United States, and Canada. And my most recent degree is in doctoral PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Manitoba, which is in city of Winnipeg in Canada. And I mostly do research on extractivism, indigenous politics, politics of indigeneity. I'm also interested on currently I'm very much interested on the research on economic sanctions and how the indigenous peoples are experiencing the sanctions regime. But I'm also very keen in learning more about the research ethics and the indigenous methodologies, especially for scholars who primarily work in the indigenous Arctic.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And I know that we talked about a couple of other projects that we could talk about together again on the show in future conversations. But today's conversation is a very interesting one. And I am going to put a pin in that discussion of sanctions as well, because as somebody who lives in Russia and, we had the entire series on the show, Sanctions as War. Sanctions are a topic that when related to the conversation, is definitely something that I like to bring in. But the discussion that we're going to be having today is going to be based on your research project, Indigenous Diamonds, which really is a terrific project. And I also want to shout out the Red Nation, which is with our dear comrade and friend Nick Estes. I heard about this project originally on the Red Nation podcast and checked out the work immediately. And I have to say this conversation on guerrilla history is long overdue, because it's been a project that's been on my mind for a couple of years since that episode came out of the Red Nation. So again, the title of the project is Indigenous Diamonds, Extractivism and Indigenous Politics in the Diamond Province of Russia. All of that will be linked in the show notes below, so I highly recommend the listeners check that out. But before we get to the project itself, can you talk a little bit more about Sakha with the listeners? As you mentioned, it's in the northeastern part of Russia, and it's kind of famous for two things, or maybe three things. One is that it's more or less the diamond capital of the Northern Hemisphere, if not the world. Another is that,
unfortunately,
it's very famously one of the coldest places in the world. And another thing it's famous for is that it's, if I remember correctly, the largest single administrative division of any place in the world. It's about the same size area-wise as India, but not quite the population of India. Right. So can you talk a little bit about Sakha, the Sakha people also, and a little bit then into the history of discovery of diamonds within Sakha, because that's really where this conversation regarding your research project is going to take off from then.
Right. So the Sakha people are not federally recognized indigenous, as according to the Constitution of 1991, I believe. However, we are indigenous to the Sakha Republic, and there are also smaller indigenous groups like Evenki, who I predominantly work with for my research studies. But we are indigenous to the region. And as you have mentioned, it's very cold. It's one of the coldest areas because half of it is located in the Arctic. And also, it's because of that, it's very sparsely populated. So our population is not very big. It's only maybe like 490-something thousand people. And it's famous with again, as you have mentioned, with the diamond mining, which started in the 1950s. But also, aside from the diamond mining, the Sakha Republic is also very popular and very famous with the other natural resources. So it has been essentially the primary location where most of the natural resources come within Russia. So I guess this is I don't even know what else to say.
Well, I have a small follow-up then. Can you talk a little bit? So you have this really handy timeline in the beginning of the report itself that I like to refer to from time to time to keep things straight in my head in terms of when they happened. But one of the things that might be interesting also for the listeners is how Sakha became part of Russia. I know that's not like really a focus of the study, but might be at least interesting because Sakha is not, within Russia, we actually... believe it or not, we talk about it pretty frequently at my place of work and amongst friends. I have several people that I want to go and do some tourism in Sakha with. There's a couple of things there that we'd like to check out and do. But so it's talked about, at least where I live and work here, it's talked about fairly frequently. But I'm guessing the vast majority of our listeners, if they've heard of Sakha, have only heard of it in passing. So maybe a little bit more of that history of integration within the Russian Empire might be stimulating and useful for them in terms of how this history then unfolds.
So the area which is now the Sakha Republic has been integrated into the Russian Empire in 17th century, but it kind of happened, gradually, so it didn't happen right away. But up to the beginning of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was not very much interested in granting the citizenship, to the Inorodцы, how they called the predominantly non-white population, like the people who live in very far-flung areas within what is now Russian Federation. So the process was very gradual, and in the beginning, we're not necessarily the part of Russia. It just happened. It has been happening since the 17th century, and it started with the fur trading. But it was very unequal fur trading. It wasn't necessarily like trading. It was the taxing, right? Like the taxation in fur, which is very similar to what is happening with the other Arctic communities. Like, for example, in the what is now United States or what is now Canada. But these, in a sense, like very sometimes violent, but also laid back attitude towards the local indigenous population coming from the imperial government. It changed in the early 20th century when the local population, they became full citizens of the new Soviet Union. And what is now Sakha Republic also became the part of the Soviet Union as a new autonomous republic. So, and of course, like the relationship with the central Russia has been very complicated, mostly in my understanding, in my individual understanding, because of the natural resources and because of the extractive activities, and also some of the, I guess, like problematic policies that the Imperial Russia and also the Soviet Union they had towards the indigenous groups, indigenous communities, specifically in the north. But at the same time, like I grew up during the Soviet Union. I caught like the 1980s, and also I also caught and experienced the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1990s, and after the neoliberal Russia, that period as well. So in comparison, what is happening before, like as objectively, I can say that our experiences as indigenous peoples were much better before 1990s, because they're very their policies which came to be very beneficial for our people and for the other smaller indigenous groups. But at the same time, I believe that we also need to have some critical perspective, right? On the experiences of minority groups during the Soviet times. And I guess, like the only thing that I'm trying to do is not to view our experiences as just black and white, because they were very complex, and we still have very complicated relationship with the central Russia, and it has been for a long time. And I would say like this is the only thing that I'm trying to do with my research. I'm trying to provide not necessarily objective because I'm from there, but more balanced perspective on and conversations on our experiences at the time and nowadays as well. So,
yeah, I just want to throw in real quickly. You mentioned that, of course, this was an autonomous republic, although autonomy is, a relative term, and particularly,
yes, it's very murky.
Yes, particularly when we're talking about places that are in resource-rich locations. So when we have a people that supposedly, and I'm not talking with regard to Russia in particular, the Soviet Union in particular, but this is like almost a universal thing, that when we see there is an indigenous group to an area, even when the federal government of that location grants them sovereignty or autonomy or whatever in their constitution, it seems like sovereignty and autonomy only goes so far when resources are present. And this is something that we see in many different locations. You can look at the Sami in northern Finland, Sweden, Norway. Of course, we can talk about First Nations people in Canada, in very many resource-rich locations. And even today, we see, pipelines being built in indigenous territory in North America. And in today's world, where we are supposedly, we being the governments of the United States and Canada, I don't know why I always say we, but, that's who I'm referring to, the United States and Canadian governments, supposedly are at this stage where they do understand that these groups have sovereignty and autonomy. It only extends until they need to put a new pipeline in through indigenous territory, and then that sovereignty and autonomy magically disappears at that moment. So it's always interesting to think about, what does autonomy mean at a given point in time, and given the context of what is available in that area? And that's something that certainly is going to come up during this conversation regarding diamonds in particular. But as you said, Sakha is quite rich in a lot of other resources as well. But taking us to the period in which diamonds were discovered, I think that maybe the listeners might be interested to know if there was something akin to like a diamond rush. So, we have this, and I am aware that a lot of our listeners, not the majority, but many of them are from the United States in particular. And when you think about these precious materials that are then found in these quote unquote far-flung places like California back in 1849, or in Sakha in the 1950s, what we see in the case of California in particular is this rush towards material. Actually, my home region, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, also had a rush of people looking for silver and gold as well. And when they came in, they found there wasn't much silver or gold, but there was a lot of copper. So some of them did stay for that. But there were these mineral or material rushes. Perhaps the listeners who are familiar with that history and the American context in terms of these material rushes would be interested to know if there was something akin to a diamond rush once the diamonds were found in Sakha.
Like when I think about that, like historically speaking, I wouldn't call it a diamond rush because like the context, the economic and the political context was very different during the Soviet times, right? Like during the 1950s. But I believe that your listeners would be very interested to learn that actually the diamond mining, it also started with the sanctions on the Soviet Union coming from the United States. Because in the beginning, like Russia didn't, the Soviet Union, they didn't have much of the interest in diamonds because, like we're talking about the socialist states, and there's not necessarily a big market, like for these kind of like gems, the gem market. But there was a high demand for global consumers, specifically in Europe, in the European countries, United States, and in North America. So in the early 1950s, because the Soviet Union was a communist country, it has been heavily sanctioned by the United States. And in 1950, I believe it was in 1950, the United States Congress, they passed the Battle Act, which put the embargo on any materials which were considered to be as supplements, like in the assistance for military development at the time in the socialist states, like for example Cuba or China, Korea at the time, and of course the Soviet Union. And one of these materials were the technical diamonds. So initially, the Soviet Union was very much interested in technical diamonds because it was right after the World War II. And the diamonds became to be recognized as very important part in building the military, but also technology. So the Soviet Union was, and the Soviet government at the time, they are much more interested in the technical diamonds, but not necessarily in gem diamonds. And this is how everything started, because the sanctions coming from the United States, they cut the access of the Soviet Union to the internationally available global diamond market. And they used to buy it from the European companies, specifically De Beers, which is the South African UK company, right? Like, so they used to have, like, before that, they used to buy it from them. However, everything changed after that sanctions, after that embargo, and at the time, like, Soviet government was like, we have huge territory and they're bound to be something, like some diamond deposits, and this is how all started. And the early geologists, they found these similarities of the geological. I don't know
geological formations.
Yeah, geological formations, I guess, like in the nature, like geological nature, which was observed in South Africa, in the diamond deposit in South Africa. So they found the similar formations in my home region. And this is how all started. And the first diamond was discovered in 1954. In 1954, and the first diamond deposit was opened also in 1954.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is the rush that we're talking about, but we need to remember that, again, the search was for technical diamonds because of the embargo, and then, however, the interest shifted, like, over time to the gem diamonds, because the deposits that we have in the Sakha Republic, they have predominantly gem diamonds, and apparently they're very specific, and they're very valuable to the international consumers, specifically European and American consumers. And the Soviet Union at the time, like in 1960s, they realized that, like, we're going to have more profit from the gem diamonds in comparison to the technical diamonds. And this is how the whole dealing with the De Beers started in late 1950s, and it continued till I think they still have some kind of like partnership in exporting the diamonds coming from my home region.
So I have one more kind of history-heavy question before I turn towards focusing on the study itself a little bit more, which is that, you mentioned that the first diamond was found in 1954, but then the amount of diamonds that come out are just remarkable. Before the sanctions began in 2022, Sakha was supplying a full 25% of the global market of diamonds.
Yes.
Now, listeners, let that number sink in for a second. This one region is supplying 25% of the entire global market of diamonds up until the point in which sanctions were imposed in 2022. So how does that dynamic work in terms of going from diamonds not being discovered there until 1954, which is relatively late compared to many other diamond-producing areas, to being a full quarter of the world's global diamond supply? And this is also, keeping in mind, listeners, just about halfway through there, a little bit more than halfway through that period of time, is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And that process continues unabated in terms of diamond production through that period of time, and continues to ramp up until, as I mentioned, the point where sanctions are imposed in 2022. So can you take us through that history of how Sakha became so productive in terms of supplying the global diamond market, and kind of who was responsible for extracting these diamonds, and who is kind of the more interesting question given the dissolution of the Soviet Union and that interregnum there?
So the during the Soviet period, because again we're talking about the socialist state, these kind of large-scale industries, they belong to the Soviet nation. Right? Like, so they were 100% nationalized. So, and the profit, they're going to Central Russia, but like but afterwards the profits with the dealings with De Beers specifically, because De Beers at the time, since 1960s, have been buying most of the diamonds produced within the Soviet Union. Despite, and they had disagreements that despite how much produced, the De Beers had to buy most of it. And, despite the quality, despite the quantity, I believe 95 or up to 99% of all the diamonds, they're going to De Beers. So it was a nationalized industry, and it belonged to the whole Soviet nation. But the Sakha Republic, as an autonomous republic, have been receiving its portion of the dividends and the profits in the form of the subsidies. And these subsidies they used to develop infrastructure, to develop the educational and for educational and cultural development in all of these different national projects which were important for the Soviet nation at the time. However, this relationship changed in 1990s with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when throughout 1990s there was this struggle between the central Russia, the new federal government, and the new government of the Sakha Republic. At the time, the sovereign Sakha Republic, and because Sakha Republic is located in quite isolated, in the remote area, and the climate is very harsh, despite the fact that the population is quite small, but still the region always required more assistance coming from the central government. When everything collapsed, everything just stopped. Right? And I believe that the people who grew up during the 1990s, who experienced, this collapse of the Soviet Union, they would understand what I mean. When literally overnight everything changes, everything collapses. But our new sovereign government, they decided that they're going to try to create the benefit to the local population, more benefit to the local population through regionalizing, in a sense, or maybe using the term also nationalizing, locally nationalizing the most lucrative industry that we had at the time, and the most developed one, the diamond industry. They nationalized the company. They created the company Alrosa, the Almazy России Sakha, the diamonds of Russia and the Sakha, which had some of the connection to the central government, but at the same time, most of it belonged to the new sovereign republic. So that way, we received directly the benefits and the profits coming from the diamond mining industry. But also at the same time, there's very interesting developments, specifically in my home village, for example, which was the hub of the diamond mining industry since 1950s. To the point that I usually say that 3-4 generations of my family, in our community, were this way or another way affected by the extractive activities which were happening on in our territories. So, and the developments that were happening within, for example, my village, and also some other areas which also were the centers of the diamond mining, the development of the cutting industry, cutting and polishing of diamonds, which used to be done in central Russia. But because the new government, they decided that, okay, we're going to create more employment opportunities and to try to get more profit from the diamond mining. So we need to have cutting and polishing activities within the region. And I clearly remember that in the 1990s, like early 1990s, there was this surge of employment opportunities for cutting and polishing the diamonds for the local people. But most of it disappeared in late 1990s, early 2000s, like when Alrosa became partly federalized, like the central Russian government at the time, like also in 1990s, they didn't like that the Sakha Republic is only one region. They hold more power within the diamond mining industry. And they are also like personal conflict with Boris Yeltsin and our president at the time, Mikhail Nikolaev. So it was like very complex, complex situation. And what happened is now the federal government, the central Russian government, they own 25% of shares. And we own, was it like 25% or it was, 32%. And we own the other 32% of the shares for the company Alrosa. So it's a equal sharing. But at the same time, I forgot what I was going to say.
That's okay. Well, we'll stop right there because I want to come back to, you had mentioned the impacts of the extractive industry, and that's something that'll certainly come up when we talk about the study itself. And also this idea of how the company is being shared in various ways, and that'll also loop back to sanctions at the end of the conversation. But I do want to take a step back from that heavy focus on history at the moment and turn back to the study itself now. So we've kind of been going over the history of Sakha in Russia and in terms of the diamond discovery and development of that industry within Sakha. But now I want to talk about the project itself. So, you've mentioned in your previous answer some personal connections that you have, as most people in Sakha do, with the diamond industry in the Republic. But what made you decide to take up this particular project, Indigenous Diamonds? What was kind of the germ in your mind that made you decide that this was the project that you were going to take? And then what was the way in which you originally saw the project taking form when you were kind of visualizing what this project would be at that initial step? And what was the methodology that you set out with when you began this project? So a little bit of a nerdy question, but our listeners are nerds, so they won't be insulted by me calling them that. I mean, you listen to the show and you're a nerd, so here we go.
Okay, so the study itself started with my dissertation when I was a student, PhD student at the anthropology department of the University of Manitoba. So my dissertation was about indigenous activism, specifically focusing on indigenous women's activism in my home region. And I worked with women activists in the Arctic, with the indigenous Evenki and Sakha women. And at the time, I did my research in 2017, 2018. I did the ethnographic fieldwork. And during at that time, the indigenous territory, which is, like in the higher Arctic, was experiencing the beginning of extractive activities, specifically diamond mining extractive activities in their homelands. And so I had this interest because I also come, as I have mentioned, I come from the community, from the village, which has been the hub of the diamond mining industry since the very beginning, since 1950s. So I had this, like the natural interest, I guess, based on my own experiences and the experiences of my family and my communities. And what intrigued me the most is that we were embroiled in a sense, like our lives and experiences were intersected with the diamond mining since 1950s, but these communities, they're just going to experience what we went through. And that's why I became very interested, like how these indigenous communities, how they're going to view these encroaching extractive activities, and how they build the relationship with the company, but also what is their perception, like of what is happening on their lands. So this is how it started, and I did my ethnographic research, and I wrote my dissertation, again specifically focusing on the indigenous activism. But then when I came to University of Toronto as a postdoctoral fellow, my supervisor, he advised me to use some of the data that I collected, but I didn't use in my dissertation, and maybe have a different perspective, like on diamond mining, and also the indigenous experiences within the region. And I was at the time in the beginning in September, I clearly remember September 2022. I was reading, I read our local regional news every day, and I noticed these new narratives, popping up, coming out within our regional newspapers, connecting indigenous identities and indigenous cultures to diamond mining and to diamonds. And it was something very new to me, because I haven't seen that before. And another thing that I got interested is how this very complex relationship between the local indigenous peoples and diamonds as an object has been visually represented. And not only visually, but also discursively represented in the mass media, but also, in the company, the Alrosa company reports, and the narratives that they created about their work within the region. So I got very interested in that, and I decided that this is something very new, very 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 new discourses that I have never seen before, and this is how it all started. Because and this is where the title comes from, because the diamonds which come from my home region at the time and now, they became to be represented as indigenous diamonds, through this connection, artificially created connection to indigenous identities and the indigenous cultures and and also indigenous labor. And I found these dynamics to be very interesting, and that's why I decided to explore it more, to look at the history of diamond mining, to look at the history of indigenous identity recognition, because it's trying to understand how the indigeneities and indigenous identities, how they are articulated in my home region, and also try to see and try to analyze the experiences of the local indigenous communities, and intersecting and interconnecting all of these discourses and narratives together. And this is how the study was born.
Well, that leads us to talking about what's in the study then. So within this study, you have 3 chapters, and they're titled Who is Indigenous in Russia? A History of Diamond Production in the Sakha Republic and Indigenous Diamonds. Part 2, or Chapter 2, A History of Diamond Production in the Sakha Republic, we talked about a bit in the kind of history discussion that we had before. And you did mention the question of who is considered indigenous a little bit in your initial answer, like the very first answer that we had in this conversation. But I think that is definitely where we should turn the conversation to now. And I'll just open the discussion with the question that you pose in the title of that chapter. Who is indigenous in Russia? And then can you describe also, the way in which you tried to tackle this question and analyze it?
Yeah, so it's a very good question to start because
pat yourself on the back.
yes, exactly. So as I have mentioned before, Sakha people, we are indigenous to the Sakha Republic. However, federally, legally speaking, we're not recognized as indigenous, and we don't have the indigenous status. However, we are recognized as indigenous according to the international standards of indigeneity, which are formulated in United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And, and aside from that, we always knew that we are indigenous to this land. So, generally speaking, the politics of recognition of indigeneity and of who is indigenous are very different from one place to another, from one nation state to another, considering the historical background and the political situation and the economic conditions and such. So we need to remember that, in a sense that who is indigenous who is recognized as indigenous in one place can be non-recognized as indigenous in another place, because how the legal politics of recognition they work, they are very diverse and very different from place to another. Within Russia, before 1990s, the indigeneity was connected to the groups which were recognized as small-numbered indigenous groups. Малочисленные коренные народы or коренные малочисленные народы. And this category was formulated in the early years of the Soviet Union. And the primary characteristics of the small-numbered indigenous peoples were connected to, this different culture, the traditional economy, like, for example, hunting, fishing, and gathering, and trapping. But most importantly, it was connected to the quantity, to the population size. So if the group was the population of the group was more than 50,000 people, it was not recognized as indigenous, despite the fact that they might have recognized themselves as indigenous. And this was actually the primary reason, like, why we're not recognized as indigenous since that time. And after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the new federal government of Russia, they kind of continued with that legacy of politics of recognition. And however, they also mention in some of the documents that I found from the 1990s, when they put together the very specific classification and the criteria for who can be recognized as indigenous within the Russian Federation in post-1990s, 1991 Russian Federation. So they also try to make it not necessarily equivalent, but similar to the international categorization of indigeneity. But interestingly, at the same time, Russia, as a nation state, they didn't ratify the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because since 1990s, they claim that, we have better way of recognizing indigeneity, but also better support system and the services provided for indigenous peoples within the Russian Federation. So this is the because of that, like because of this numerical criterion that exists only within Russian Federation, it doesn't exist anywhere else. Like, for example, us as Sakha people were not recognized as indigenous. And that, yes.
Neither are the Crimeans, just as a Crimean Tatar
Right.
example for my wife
Yes.
is Crimean Tatar, and they are not
Yes.
federally recognized as indigenous people, even though
Yes.
if you look at international recognition of the group, they are internationally recognized as an indigenous people, but aren't recognized within Russia as an indigenous people, similar to the Sakha people.
Yeah. So it's a very unique politics of recognition that exists only within the Russian Federation. Like the emphasis on the population size and the So this is how the politics of recognition work. However, it doesn't mean that like there are indigenous peoples who self-identify and self-recognize as indigenous peoples, and including my group, for example.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to, examine again the ways in which indigeneity is conceptualized by the group that is indigenous versus the way that indigeneity is conceptualized by a federal government that is governing over the people. And, you did touch on that a little bit in your answer, and also is explored more in this paper. But I think that, unfortunately, we're not going to have time to dive so deep into all of these topics. There's really so much that I want to talk about, but I am being cognizant of the fact that we have a hard cutoff time today. So I want to skip past chapter 2, which again is the history of diamond production in Sakha, since we did refer to that in the opening part of this conversation, and jump to chapter 3, Indigenous Diamonds. And this really picks up, you mentioned in the introduction to this chapter, since 2021, Alrosa became a public company with shares traded on the Moscow Stock Exchange. And then you talk more about the breakdown in terms of how those shares are then split about. And you did talk a little bit about that in a previous answer as well. But this question of indigenous diamonds, we were just talking about this question of indigeneity, who is indigenous in Russia. And now you turn us to indigenous diamonds. And this is really a fascinating process in terms of this conceptualization and this process of conceptualization. So can you take us into that part of your study? And I may have a couple of follow-ups depending on how you address it.
So, like this thinking about the diamonds as indigenous diamonds, it specifically came from the company narratives that I mentioned before, that I found to be very intriguing and completely novel, because previously the diamonds were not necessarily connected to the representations of the diamonds. They are not necessarily connected to the to indigeneity. And especially speaking to the local indigeneity and to the local indigenous communities. However, how it became to be connected is, I believe, because of the very recent developments, globally speaking, especially in North America, of the processes of indigenization of various commodities. Like within the global market of, again, of different commodities. How indigeneity came to be seen as profitable. So we're talking about the processes of the commodification of indigeneity, right? And I observed the same processes in the company narratives as well. And this is how the indigeneity connects to diamonds, because when I think about that, and I believe I mentioned that before, but it's important to remember that most of I would say like 99% of consumers of diamonds coming from my home region, they are in the West, within the Western societies, the Western consumers. Predominantly European consumers and also North American consumers, the American and the Canadian. And it has been historically like that since 1950s, since the very beginning. And it's actually quite ironic, because, like we produce up to 99% of all diamonds. However, we don't ourselves consume them because we just don't have any money. I literally don't know anyone who, like in my family or in my, like among my friends, like who have any diamonds. So like I found that to be very interesting, right? Like, and another thing like that we need to remember is that we're talking about the capitalist production, and the production is connected to the consumption. And this is actually the question that not so many people ask, like in my home region and also within Russia as well. Like we're producing all of these diamonds, like 99% of like 25 up to 27% of all of the global diamond market. But no one asks the question, like, who is buying all of these diamonds? Like, who are the consumers? Who is generating, like, and the perpetuating the extractivism, these horrible extractive activities in my home region? So this is actually the question that I decided to think about more and to ask in the study, specifically in the in chapter 3, because like I observed and experienced the impact of extractivism, of diamond mining.
I want to put the pin in that specific point right there, the impact of the extractivism. And I'll also just to circle back for one brief second before I have you dive a little bit deeper into the impacts of the extractive diamond industry. You mentioned that you don't know anybody in Sakha personally who has diamonds from Sakha.
Yeah.
This is also, true in most of these mineral-rich locations. If you look at diamond mines in South Africa, again, if you go in the communities that are making up the vast majority of the workers in those diamond mines, you are not going to find any workers that have diamonds or family members of those workers who have diamonds. And if you do find them, they will be arrested for stealing the diamonds because they certainly don't have the money to buy them. It's like that not just with diamonds, but in most of these places which are the economy is based on extraction of some precious primary commodity. You don't see people who are producing it able to do it. So I just wanted to also, draw that parallel between what you see in Sakha and also in the diamond producing regions of Southern Africa as well. But sorry, you want to say something on that?
But I was going to say, but the discourses that surround the diamonds coming from the Sakha Republic, they're very different.
Exactly.
Right? Because they're connected to indigeneity. Because this connection to indigeneity, in a sense, indigenous diamonds, right? They become even more unique. And within the capitalist system, because of this rarity and uniqueness of the diamonds coming from the indigenous territories, they become more valuable to the Western consumers.
Well, and that was actually the exact point that I was going to drive towards, is that whether you see it's coming from this place where the diamond would be considered a blood diamond, or if you go to a place where the diamond is considered an indigenous diamond, you still don't see local communities utilizing that, like in their family as part of their family heirlooms or jewelry or whatever. It's very similar in those two, even though the narrative and we have an episode upcoming on narrative. Like the entire episode will be based on narrative coming soon with a couple of guests. But the narrative is extremely different between those two, even though on that specific point, it's the same. Now, I also want to turn back towards where you were talking about the impacts of extraction. And again, the impacts are felt where? In indigenous communities. We're talking about negative impacts, environmental impacts, societal impacts within indigenous communities as a result of the extraction of these indigenous diamonds. So can you talk a little bit about those impacts on the communities within the areas that are extracting, again, quote unquote, indigenous diamonds?
Most importantly, of course, it's imperative to talk about the environmental impact because the company Alrosa, they operate the open pit mining activities, which means that you're just digging the hole, digging the hole since 1950s. They in different areas within the so-called Diamond Act, coming from this quite horrible and very harmful, not only for the environment, for the nature, but also to the local communities. Because we, as Indigenous people, we practice the mixed economy. So we are employed, like in the wage labor, but at the same time, we have been practicing our traditional economies since for a long time. We never stopped, So my people were involved in hunting, fishing, gathering, herding, horse herding, but also in the high Arctic, you have the smaller indigenous communities who are involved in the reindeer herding. And as you can imagine, when the environment changes and when the environment becomes harmful, it directly affects the non-human life. And not only talking about the animals, that we hunt, not only the fish, but also the rivers and the air and the soil. But the experiences of that, of course, they are very varied. They are very diverse because some communities, they are located much closer to the diamond deposits, to these the holes. But
again, remember, listeners, the area, the region that we're talking about is the size of India. So some of these communities will be very far away from the diamond producing locations,
Yes.
and others are basically right on them.
Yes. For example, when I was doing my research with the Evenka communities in one of the indigenous territories in the high Arctic, most of the conversations were about reindeer herding and the hunting reindeer, the wild reindeer. So, for example, one of the villages that I visited, and I talked to the village, the members of this village, they told me they didn't have the wild reindeer running closer to them, for hunting, for almost 10 years. Since the beginning of the geological explorations for diamond deposits in the area. And, considering that they don't have any other opportunities for protein supply, it makes a huge impact. So it creates the very intense food insecurity. And it has been happening for almost 10 years. To the point that actually that village, which was much more isolated and remote in the high Arctic, they told me that they have to buy reindeer meat from the administrative center. And it doesn't make any sense because they are traditionally wild reindeer hunters, and they are also traditionally reindeer herders. And another case, the important case can be the pollution of the waters. And it was actually the pollution of the water was one of the important causes of the conflict that happened in 2015, 2016 between this specific village and the community, this community in the indigenous territory, and the diamond mining company. Because the diamond mining company, they didn't receive the consent to do the explorations for diamond deposits. And of course, the local people were very concerned about that because, again, the explorations were taking place on the river, and that river was the only source of fresh water source for the local people, and that's why they decided that we're going to oppose the explorations, and the further development of the mining close to the river. However, in 2016, so it was going on for 1 year, but in 2016, they ultimately agreed, to explorations and also, further development of the mining because of the very harsh conditions that most of the indigenous communities in the Arctic, they experience. Because the company, they promise, like the infrastructure development and also to provide the monetary subsidies to the local community and the, like support the educational projects and the cultural projects within the several local communities as well. So, and like I talk all about this in the chapter 3. And one of the things that I want the readers to take from the study, but also specifically from the chapter 3, is that how complex the experiences are, and how complicated it can become for the local communities who are trying to negotiate between their existence as indigenous peoples, like practicing the traditional economies, but on the other hand, also thinking about, in a sense, like the social reproduction and the community reproduction that unfortunately currently can't happen without involvement of the outside, like of the outside forces, like taking, in that case, for example, the diamond mining company.
I want to dive in a little bit deeper on this specific point, because I think that it just problematizes the story in an interesting way and in a useful way, because it's very easy for those of us on the ecological left, pro-indigenous left, to think in terms of negative impacts solely of extraction. But as you point out, the company does promise a lot of good and actually does deliver a fair amount of, as you mentioned,
some of it,
not as much as they promise, most certainly, but they do deliver a fair amount of good in terms of social reproductive value, and that is an important part of the story to tell as well, because if you are solely focusing on the environmental side of things, which of course we need to heavily focus on, and we also need to heavily focus on the way that it disrupts indigenous traditions, lifestyles, the indigenous economy, we do also need to think about these things that are promised, and some of which, as you correctly point out, not nearly all of, but some of which actually are carried out. And that's an important part of the story as well for people to be aware of. So can you talk a little bit about what has Alrosa, I don't want to ask like what have they promised, because of course, over time there's always new things that are coming out in terms of what's going to be happening. But what are some of like the major initiatives or projects that they state that they are in support of? And then turning towards what we actually see, can you talk about some of the actual positive things that have come as a result of diamonds being extracted, and also some of these promises which have not been fulfilled?
So, for generally speaking, for the Sakha Republic, the diamond mining industry is extremely important. And this is one of the things that a lot of people don't understand, like, especially now with the sanctions on the company, directly on the company, people don't necessarily think how the sanctions and this, like, created sanctions regime on the company within Russia, how it's going to affect the local indigenous peoples who directly depend, unfortunately, on the diamond mining industry. The Sakha Republic, the budget of the Sakha Republic, up to 47% comes from the extractive activities, specifically diamond mining. And it's a huge number. Again, considering that we live within extremely harsh climate, the infrastructure development is very difficult. And also we're located in quite isolated remote area. These are the things that we need to take into consideration when we think about the diamond mining activities, and also how the local people, how they essentially survive, right? Because during the Soviet times, most of the services, they have been provided by the government. But nowadays, it's very different. So most of the services, they are they go on only when they're predominantly supported by the dividends, and the profits, the shares coming from the diamond mining industry. So there is a heavy budget dependence, regional budget dependence on the revenues from the diamond mining industry, and I think it's kind of complicates things, from the from the get go, right? So what they do,
just if I may, I mean the whole discussion is so complicated because there's layers that emerge because of previous layers. So just thinking about some of the previous things that you mentioned, Sakha is very remote. It's very difficult to get from place to place. And so if you're thinking about what is required for people to travel, that is quite difficult. And then you also think about one of your previous answers where you state that people in some of the smaller localities are no longer able to do reindeer herding as a result of some of the extractive processes that are taking place as a result of the diamond industry. So what does that mean? In order to get reindeer meat, these people have to travel. Well, if they're going to travel, they also need the ability to travel, which requires capital to come in. And where does the capital come in from? The same diamond industry that has disrupted the indigenous economy and has made it essential for those people to travel to the urban centers to get the reindeer meat. So again, just by uncovering one layer, you then problematize this entire discussion further by creating new layers that are built upon it. And at the end of it, you're left at a point where you're thinking, okay, so how do we analyze this? Because, if it wasn't for this, we wouldn't have this. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't have that. But we do have this, so we need this. There's all of these layers that are built on one another. So, thinking through those questions is really a difficult thing indeed.
Right. There are also constant negotiations, right? Like with the central Russian government, our regional local government and company. So it is also very complex. But when you think about the, I would say the important question is how our regional government, but also the rural governments, the rural administrative centers, the communities, right? The communities, how they use the money that they receive from some of the shares that they have. And I think this is the important question to ask, and how they use it. So most of the money, for example, my community and also the communities where I did my research in the Arctic, they invest in the community. So it doesn't go to one person. When you think this is very capitalist relations, very neoliberalized capitalist relations. However, if you look at how the local people, they spend money that they get from extractive activities, it's I believe that it kind of changes the perspective. So how they spend it. So they invest in infrastructure development, which is extremely important in the Arctic. And I'm talking about the very rural communities. We are very remote, but also imagine, much more rural areas in the higher Arctic. It's very difficult to get there. So the infrastructure development is the key. And so this is where they invest. The first thing that they do is the investment in the infrastructure development. And secondly, most admirably, they invest in the educational development and the cultural development within these very small communities. So in a sense, they try to elevate the community, the people who live within people who don't have a lot of opportunities, especially in the rural Arctic areas. And thinking about infrastructure development, it's when I was in one of the Arctic villages, it was very unusual for me to see how all the houses, private houses, and also the, some of the apartment buildings, small apartment buildings that they had within this Arctic village, all of them, they were connected with the heating system. And they had, the heating center. And it is extremely unusual to see in the Arctic village, like how all the houses, they're connected. So the administrative center decided that, we have a lot of old people, who can't heat their houses by themselves. And this is the first thing that we need to do with the first the revenues that come from the new extractive activities on our territory.
If I may just add, I want people to conceptualize this for a second, because when we're talking about these rural localities in Sakha, we're talking about an area that's on permafrost. So in order for the heating to be brought into people, we're talking about above ground pipes that carry hot water from a boiler to multiple houses with very thick insulated cladding surrounding them to each of these buildings. What that means is that there is a large amount of investment that's required, because you're having to build a boiler plant in this village, not in an administrative center. You're going to have to connect it and insulate it to each of the houses, most of which would have originally been set up for heating internally with wood fire.
You need to get the materials, you need to get the labor.
Yes, you need to transport all of those things to these rural localities, and of course upkeep, because once the insulation goes on that external insulation on the outside of these above ground pipes, once that starts to go, well, your heating is no longer particularly effective. So you're also having to have constant maintenance over time on this. So what we're talking about here, it may seem trivial to people who aren't familiar with the way in which that work would have to be carried out. But actually, just bringing that heat from a centralized location in a village in rural Sakha is a huge undertaking in terms of investment, in terms of material, and in terms of labor. So that's something that's definitely worth keeping in your mind, listeners.
For example, my village, where I'm from, we have the central heating only in central part of our village. The houses in the apartment buildings, they are connected to the central heating. But for example, my family house, we're not, and we have never been. It wasn't necessarily the important thing unfortunately, for our administration to do. And that's why I was amazed, when I saw that all of these, connections, and you can see the pipes, right? Like, as you have said, it's over the ground. So you could see everywhere. And I was like, this is amazing, and this is actually the decision which was made not by one person, the head of the community, but it was made by all the community members, and when they get their revenues, they come together and they decide as a community what is important. So the heating system was one of the most important things for them, in the beginning, since 2016. But they built a new school, because their old school was very old. It was from from 1960s, probably, or even earlier, from the 1950s. So you can imagine the condition, and it was very small, a small building. So they decided, we're going to invest in the development of education, because we value our younger generation. They need to get the quality education, and they need to get that education within the comfortable conditions. And that's why it was very important for them to build a new school house, the school building. But also they built a new hospital. So all of these projects which benefit directly to the community and to the community members. But also there is another thing. That I found to be very curious when I was doing the research on the Alrosa company reports, because they do include how much money they provided to these to communities where they do the diamond mining. So they list how much money and also how they're used as well. They don't necessarily demand, how the communities use the revenues, but they do include that, how this money had been spent. And the very interesting part of it was talking about the good and bad thing, providing the employment opportunities for the local, for the community members in the Arctic. Unemployment is a huge problem, especially in the rural Arctic areas. And for a lot of the community members, at least in the villages where I was, it was a very big deal, to be employed by the company. However, it is a good thing, but also there is a complication there as well, because the company was hiring local people, yes, a very small percentage of the local people. However, it was very often temporary, kind of like the seasonal work. And if you look at the statistical data, what kind of employment they have, the workforce of the company, they're predominantly migrant laborers. So, we're talking about the people who come from Central Russia, they come from Ukraine, they come from Belarusia, and they come, they work, for maybe 4 or 5 months, and then they leave, and then they come back, and so on. And the same politics is with the local people, unfortunately. And the politics of employment also very complicated with the company. But the funny thing is that in their reports in English language, not in Russian language, in English language reports, the company states that their employment, their workforce is 11.8% local indigenous people. However, if you look at the Russian report, the statistics is a bit different. So why they do that, they say we employ a lot of indigenous people, more than 1,000 indigenous people. But in this indigenous workforce, they include us, the people who are not recognized federally as indigenous. Right? But
curious how that works when it works to their advantage, right?
Yes, exactly. But because we're talking about the reports for international investors, right? And as you can imagine, because this is the region which is recognized as indigenous, whatever. So they're trying to capitalize on that. So they say that we employ more than 1,000 indigenous people. And, so the recognition politics, it doesn't necessarily recognize in a sense, but it is beneficial for them as in this internationally valuable, one of the largest diamond mining companies. However, in the Russian report, they have very different, narrative. So I found that to be very interesting, how, again, how the company, in a sense, manipulates, right? Manipulates and creates these narratives for different audiences. And they also have these, a lot of the conversation, not only, they say that we support the local indigenous peoples, but also they have these, recently, they started naming the diamonds, the big diamonds that they extract from the indigenous territories. They started giving them indigenous names. It's
I love that you had some images in the paper that were I don't want to say hilarious, but I don't know, I laughed when I saw them.
Yeah, so it's another very interesting how they're trying to they connect, right, indigeneity to diamonds as a commodity. So, but the problem is, and I talk about that in my chapter 3, the problem is that they utilize the very archaic understanding of indigeneity, and the very essentialist and the representation of local indigenous people as primitive, very traditional, living these primordial, the primitive lives, involved in the reindeer herding, wearing these very traditional, the indigenous clothes, and this is the images that they use in order to essentially sell the diamonds, right? So, and I find it to be very problematic because, again, it's very different from how local indigenous people see themselves and how they want to represent themselves. But at the same time, because they have this dependence on the diamond mining and the revenues, very tight dependence, in some cases, they have to follow these narratives that the company creates about them. So, and I found that to be very problematic. And this manipulation of the images, and the narratives, and the creating I wouldn't say like inauthentic, but very contrived. Yeah, like stereotype, like very contrived, very stereotyped representation of indigeneity, of the local indigeneity. But this is what the Western customers love, right? Like when you think about that, because again, remember that the primary consumers of the indigenous diamonds, they are in the West, and this is what they like. So, and this is what I talk about in my chapter 3.
Yeah, I want to turn. We have, unfortunately, much less time than I would like because this conversation could go on forever. It's a topic that I'm extremely interested in. But I want to turn towards the conclusion of your paper, which is very heavily focused on sanctions. And tying that together with the very last thing that you said, which is that the primary consumer of indigenous diamonds are those in the West. Now, we get to 2022, and not only are many, more than a dozen different sanctions packages put on Russia more generally, but the company Alrosa itself also is sanctioned. And your conclusion examines that sanctioning and some of the impacts of that sanctioning. So can you take us through a little bit? And again, unfortunately, we're going to have to be somewhat, brief, maybe 10 minutes on this. But really, this is something that I could talk about all day because, sanctions is something we've talked about on the show a lot and something that I think about a lot as somebody living in Russia. But can you take us into that moment in 2022 where Alrosa begins to be sanctioned and that cuts off the primary consumer from these indigenous diamonds? What is the impact? So what is the, the stated goal of this sanction, which, stated goals of sanctions are never actually the goals of sanctions. We've talked about that in our Sanctions Discourse series ad nauseum. But what was the stated goal of that sanction on Alrosa? And what is the actual impact of this sanction? And also, some ways in which the sanctions have been, I don't want to say circumvented, but some ways in which the sanctions...
They were.
Yeah, okay, let's just say circumvented. So you're a little bit more blunt than me today, but that's okay. So I'll give it over to you, Sardana. Take that away.
So what happened is since 2022, but also directly since 2022, and since 2024, I believe it was the spring 2024, the Alrosa, the largest diamond mining company within the Russian Federation, but also globally, has been sanctioned by many different countries in the West. And I remember Bahamas was also involved in that. And I was like, what's happening in the Bahamas? Okay, anyways.
Money laundering and sanctioning apparently are two things that the Bahamas specializes in.
Okay, that's a good point. So they have been sanctioned by the European Commission, by the United States, by the UK, and all of these countries. So what happened is the diamonds, the company was cut off from the global international market. So as I have said, the Western consumers are now, cut off from the diamonds coming from my home region. However, there is always a way for the capitalists, right? For capitalists. So what happened is Russia started. They have been employing the cutting and polishing labor in India for a long time, since late 2000s. So now they used to, directly state that these are diamonds which are coming from this company, and they have been extracted from the Sakha Republic, and such. But nowadays, the diamonds, they go through India, but through the cutting and polishing and mixing with other diamonds, which come from the other geographies, they lose that geographical distinction. And they in a sense, they lose that distinction of being indigenous diamonds, right? Like coming from the indigenous region. And this way, they're still acquired by the companies in the West, in Europe, and also in the North America. So, in a sense, the consumers, the Western consumers, the rich people, they still get their diamonds, but now it goes through the very complicated route. Yes. But also
very similar to oil, I mean, as well. It's not like there hasn't been sanctions that have been put on by various countries on the oil industry of Russia. And it's also not like we have various countries, in this case, in the case of oil, particularly in Eastern Europe, who... and also in Turkey to some extent, will take oil from Russia and mix them in barrels with, a couple of drops of oil from other places. And now it's mixed origin oil rather than Russian oil. This is very much the same story.
Yes. So it's very similar, like talking about these sort of global commodities, right? Which are, again, primarily consumed in the West. So, but, and another thing that the company, started investing is exploring Asian market, exploring Asian market and also Middle Eastern market. So, which I found to be very interesting, like personally. So now they're going to advertise the diamonds to the consumers in China, in Japan, and also in the Middle Eastern countries. And I'm very curious to see what kind of narratives they come from. They create in order to sell the diamonds to these new consumers. But another very important thing that the company declared, I believe, like a year ago, since the beginning of the direct sanctions on the company, is they are now saying that they're going to diversify their mining activities. So now they are going to focus not only on diamonds, which used to be like the thing before, only diamonds, but now they're investing heavily in exploration of oil deposits, and also the other, natural resources. But they are talking about gold, they're talking about gas, they're talking about oil, but primarily oil. And now most of the explorations, they happen not in the southern part of my home region, but now they're going to take most of them in the Arctic. And as you know, yes.
Yeah, I know. Okay, I didn't go ahead. You may say the thing that I was going to say anyway.
Okay, and as everyone knows, where within the conditions of the climate change, and the environment in the Arctic is the most fragile, and you can imagine what kind of impact it's going to be there. And another thing, like most of the indigenous peoples within my home region, the smaller indigenous communities, they are located in the Arctic. And I can't even imagine how they will be affected, by these explorations and their future activities.
Yeah, just to add in briefly, so the climate change is very much related to the point that I was going to make, which is that we have statements coming out from both the Russian administration and the American administration independently of one another, not just the current American administration either, but also the previous American administration. And now there is even talk about cooperation about using the Arctic and particularly the waterways of the Arctic as the climate change makes some of these sea routes passable, at least for more of the year, above the northern part of Russia and above the northern part of Canada. So again, if you're thinking about exploration of oil in those northern parts of Sakha, you're right on, that the Arctic Ocean and right on those routes in which they're talking about cooperation potentially of transit, of shipping, and also in terms of other economic potential. And that would very much fit within that economic potential, is utilizing those newly opened as a result of melting polar ice caps, but it's open sea routes for transit and installing pipelines potentially in the Arctic Ocean, which is something crazy to think about, but very much fits within the rhetoric that we're hearing.
But there is also another thing, like another part of that, another aspect of the sanctions. The economic sanctions, they affect not only the local communities, like, for example, my community, like the local indigenous communities in the Arctic, but they're also going to affect the specifically indigenous communities in the West, and also, like in other places as well, because we talked about how the Russian, the company, the Alrosa, has been cut off from the global diamond market, but it's a huge market. And the third largest producer of diamonds in the world is Canada. Canada mostly extracts the diamonds in the Northwest Territories, which is indigenous territory. Mostly indigenous peoples, they live there, diverse indigenous peoples, they live there. And I'm more concerned about that because I'm currently in Canada, and I know some people there. And so what's going to happen, Canada is not going to lose out on this opportunity. And because it's a 25% up to 27% of the global diamond market is a huge number. It's a huge profits. And actually, this is something that I noticed. Also, I observed, from the recent data on the diamond production in Canada, in the Northwest Territories, is they actually upped and they increased and they intensified their diamond production on the indigenous territories.
Again, just drawing parallels with natural gas and oil, we saw the exact same thing with American liquefied natural gas when sanctions went on the Russian natural gas industry as well. The liquefied natural gas from Russia to Europe was essentially cut off to many parts of Europe anyway. And who stepped into that niche immediately was the United States. At great profit to the United States and extreme detriment economically to Europe. So what you're talking about here is also very similar in terms of there is going to be a niche opening up in terms of the global diamond market, and diamond market from an indigenous place in particular, that is now going to have a very obvious person to step into that and try to exploit that niche in the market.
So, and that's why, I was trying to, and I'm very happy, to talk about this study here. And I had these conversations before, how the economic sanctions, they not only, they create the suffering of the indigenous communities in my home region, but they're also going to directly or indirectly affect the indigenous communities who are the most marginalized in Canada, right? Like, they're going to affect these communities as well. So I believe that we need all be concerned about economic sanctions and think about how they affect the most marginalized and most, with the most vulnerable communities within the countries which are sanctioned. So these are some of the impacts, I would say, of the economic sanctions on the communities. But again, if you remember, we talked about the regional budget. For the last, I would say 2 years, the company actually decreased the amount of the revenues, that they give to the local regional government. And also, I think 1 year, they maybe a couple of years, they actually skipped. They didn't, they didn't provided the share of the dividends that they were supposed to. And they claim that it's because of the economic sanctions. So, and because of that, there are some articles from our regional newspapers they were very concerned about that because they are like very large-scale projects were frozen because the regional budget didn't get the revenues that they were supposed to get. So and again, like our regional government, one of the things that they try to do is they try to invest in the infrastructure development and the social development, like providing the health services, educational services for the local people, which are not necessarily provided by the federal government, like trying to fill that void. And this is the direct impact effect of the economic sanctions on the local indigenous peoples.
Sanctions are war, Sardana. Sanctions are war.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are just about out of time. As I said today, unfortunately, we had a hard cutoff, but I can be happy to share with the listeners that you will be coming back on the show again in the not too distant future with a colleague of yours, someone who you did a very, very interesting project on Indigenous methodologies with. I won't introduce who the guest is now, but we'll wait until you both are on the show soon, and hopefully Adnan will be able to make that conversation as well. Really fascinating work, and I'm really looking forward to that conversation. So I'm hoping that we can sort out the timing soon. I know it's very difficult to figure out a time that works for everyone when we have people in Canada, Russia, and Indonesia all at the same time, but we will make it happen. I promise you we will make it happen.
Okay.
So on that note, then, again, listeners, our guest was Sardana Nikolaeva, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. Sardana, thank you for the time and for the research that you did on this project. Again, we'll have the project itself linked in the show notes, but is there anything else that you would like to direct the listeners to if they wanted to find more of your work or the work that the laboratory is doing?
So thank you very much for having me. This was very interesting conversation. And I apologize because, I was a little bit all over the place.
That's me at my best, is all over the place.
Yes, and I feel like I miss a lot of the details, and the nuances from the study. But this is incentive, for your listeners to go and read and find much more interesting information and the much more interesting narrative, that I talked about today here. So I will be very excited if you read the study and if you find it informative and if you learn something new about my home region, the Sakha Republic, about experiences of indigenous peoples in the Arctic, and the history of the diamond mining industry, but also of the generally speaking. So I was very happy to be here, and for now, the lab is a bit dormant, so there is no a lot of things that are happening. But on my side, I'm trying to lift, this study on sanctions and the experiences of indigenous communities in the Arctic as the result of this, as a result of the economic sanctions. So I'm hoping that maybe in future, if I, finally complete this study, we'll have more to talk about. But other than that, I don't think I have a lot of stuff, online. So, but if anyone has any questions, I would be happy if you can contact. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just read Adnan and myself out very quickly. My co-host Adnan Hussein, unfortunately, was not able to make the discussion today, but you should follow him on Twitter at Adnan A. Hussein, Husain. You can follow me on Twitter at Huck1995, HUCK1995. And just a reminder, listeners, that you can help support the show and allow us to continue making episodes like this by going to patreon.com/Guerrilla History. That's GUERRILLA History. And keep up to date with the show by following the show on social media. We're on Twitter at Guerrilla_pod. Again, Guerrilla 2 R's. On Instagram, Guerrilla_history. And you can subscribe to our free Substack to keep up to date and get updates in your email inbox at guerrillahistory.substack.com. So until next time, listeners, solidarity.